Hi everyone. I'm Sharath. I head the business for US, Latin America, and Canada for Shieldworkz. Today with me, I have Joshua, who is going to speak to us about an important topic that is common pitfalls when doing an IEC 62443 or NIST-based risk assessment. Joshua, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sharif. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Deakin. I'm the head of services at Shieldworkz. I lead our consulting and our managed service offerings, as well as delivering on the ground myself. I have a strong background in cybersecurity, particularly in OT for the last 5 to 10 years, across a number of different industries. And I have been involved in a lot of risk assessments across all of the industries I've worked in. So looking forward to giving you some key learnings from my experience and also the experience of our wider team here at Shieldworkz.
Thank you so much, Joshua. So today I have a few questions that I wanted to ask, and I know that your experience in this field is immense, and if we can get some tidbits from how to avoid these common mistakes or pitfalls when doing risk assessments, that'll be really great.
Awesome. Let's go.
So the first question that I have for you is there is this misconception in people's mind, right? Like everybody says, hey, we are NIST aligned, or we are NERC compliant, or we are IEC 62443 compliant. What is aligned or compliant, and what is the misconception around it, Josh?
It's a really good point. So when someone says they're NIST aligned or a consulting company or internally you are delivering or the receiving end of an assessment which is aligned to a standard, it means that there isn't a formal compliance mandate or requirement at the end of it. That tends to be my understanding of what that means. So you'll be in a position where you can understand your gaps, you can understand your strengths against a given standard. But at the end of the day, that process in itself doesn't consist of a formal compliance check at the end of it. So, in Europe, for example, I've seen a lot of organizations that are currently on the cusp of being in the purview of the NIS2 directive, but not formally obligated to comply, aligning to the objectives of the NIS2 framework in preparation for when that compliance mandate becomes part of their process.
Okay.
When someone says they're going to deliver a compliant solution or a compliant piece of OT equipment, then you would expect to see the certification that has gone through a formal compliance check from a competent certification body against one of the, I would say, known and trusted certification processes that exist, particularly for 62443 as a standard. And from an assessment perspective, when they say it will achieve compliance, that means at the end of it, there will be a compliance check with certification body coordination baked into that process. So align means build, but not comply. Comply means build and comply as part of the same process.
Okay. So that brings me to another interesting question. So let's take a scenario, okay? The scenario is like the plant wants only the IT firewalls to be assessed, right? Like the controls around IT firewalls to be assessed, and they ignore OT. So what is the pitfall there? Plus, what is the pushback from the field when you've done it on the field? Have you faced any scenario like this or a pushback on such a case?
I've seen cases where there's been an ISO 27001 accreditation process that has stopped at the IT firewall or the firewall which is considered to be managed by IT, and where the responsibility of the field team then continues below that if we're talking in the purging model. It's difficult to achieve a very robust accreditation for an OT environment using an information security standard such as ISO 27001. So I've seen the frustrations of on-site teams where they feel that they've done a strong amount of work to reach a good level of maturity, and the compliance process should be more focused on 62443 or the relevant domestic standard that exists for that given sector.
Hmm.
So sometimes there is a disconnect between operations teams and IT teams where there isn't a strong cross, I would say, pollinating cybersecurity function, where compliance requirements or standards do not consider OT with the same level of rigor as IT or corporate information security. Because at the end of the day, a firewall is a firewall, and the most important way to view it is not device specific, but as two ecosystems. And
Hmm.
where the IT and OT ecosystem converges, that should be considered in the scope of a compliance assessment against an OT designed industry framework rather than an IT one, such as ISO 27001, to deliver real value.
Thank you for that. So in an assessment, like what are the common mistakes that you've seen, like in an IC 62443 assessment or a NIST CSF based assessment? What are the common mistakes that you have seen or you have come across in your experience?
I think the common mistakes I see are not necessarily the content or the controls assessment that's done, but
Hmm.
it's how that is brought back to the business, what I sometimes call the so what factor,
Hmm.
and then translated into business terms. And you'll see a lot of posts on LinkedIn about this, about cybersecurity professionals being better at being able to speak in business terms rather than just speaking in control maturity and our own language. So
Hmm.
I think there is a language gap between cybersecurity professionals in the field and what decision makers need to hear. So mistakes in that vein include not understanding the real impacts of what a cybersecurity scenario could cause on site, given the
Hmm.
processes. And in an OT context, that's arguably easier to understand maybe than a corporate asset because of the tangible safety and the tangible compliance aspects that exist should a part of the process become unavailable. But that being said, you need to be able to really clearly articulate why a critical asset or why a certain attack scenario is so critical, because it will lead to downtime X, which could lead to impact Y, in very
Hmm.
simple business terms, using the business impact language that the company is familiar with. And I don't see that being done very well in a lot of the assessments that I've seen in the industry at the moment. The second thing is when giving recommendations, you have to make your recommendations practical and also realistic to the resources and the budget that's available within the company. Um,
Hmm.
to achieve OT cybersecurity best practice or to deliver a reference architecture takes years,
Hmm.
and takes a lot of care and time. So the implementation plan that you have, it's more of an art rather than a pure science to take 100 gaps and distill that into the most important things that are going to achieve real impact in terms of return on investment from a risk reduction perspective, but are also practical to implement. And that's why it's so important to have within your team doing the assessment someone that has been on the other side in that industry or in that position, so they can
Okay.
give you the feedback that, guys, this is the reality of what that would mean in implementation mode. So that is baked into the assessment and the output that comes of it. So the business leader can understand not only impact and risk, but the practical realities of addressing those risks. I think those two things are often quite missed,
Hmm.
and need to be, there's too much work sometimes that clients need to do to understand the so what factor of an assessment that they've paid for.
Got it. One thing that stuck in my mind in this conversation is the language gap, right? The language gap, is it because of the difference in the technical knowledge that the assessment team would have versus the management, or is it like the skills and mindset of the people who are doing the assessment?
I think it's sometimes it can be a combination of both. I think that the skills gap would be, having someone maybe who's very technically proficient, but hasn't got the battle scars of actually having tried to implement that in practice within that industry context. Because every industry is different. They might face the same challenges, but how you apply them within that environment, you need to understand that kind of local thinking. So that can
Hmm.
be the experience gap, I guess, rather than a skills gap. And we try and we make sure we plug that in every team that we assemble for an assessment. The second thing is a mindset shift, which is you need to be able to at the end of a process, take a step out of the technical compliance view and approach it with a fresh pair of eyes from a business perspective.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, what you're suggesting is going to have an impact on decisions which are linked to making or losing revenue at the end of the day.
Mm.
Um, so taking a business view as far as you can, and that's embedded in risk reduction and impact, um, you'll be much better to translate your findings into things that will ultimately enable you to continue your relationship with that customer.
Got it. And going one level below, right? That is, say you're not reporting or you're talking to the management, but you're in the process of doing an assessment, and the operations team or the plant manager says, "Hey, I'm worried about like uptime. I care about uptime and not compliance, and I have KPIs to meet. So please come next year because I don't have time to do an assessment now."
Mm.
How do you
That's a
handle that?
that's a good one. So compliance then, well, what you can say is if there is a very tangible metric, around the amount of revenue that may be lost in the event of a loss of downtime, which is their top priority, you can say, well, if your priority is uptime, this is the let us honor and maintain that priority by making sure that your uptime continues, because cybersecurity isn't only about preventing attack, it's about ensuring continuity and operational resilience.
Mhm.
And in tandem with that, our assessment or our advice would make sure that you're doing all that you can so that you don't fall foul of these compliance penalties that will have or do have quite nasty financial implications associated with them. So in that case, there are ways that you can, their concern is valid, but the necessity of understanding where you stand, when it comes
Mhm.
to cybersecurity, still remains the same.
Got it. Okay. And say the teams are like more IT focused, that is, they're looking at the IT part of the OT network, and they've dealt with IT cybersecurity, OT cybersecurity is new. And there is a bias, so they decide to look at only parts of the OT network, like for example, putting checking the controls on the IT firewall and not looking into anything OT. And they
Mm.
define the scope of the assessments um, just to look at the IT. So, what do you think is a pitfall there, and where do you think things can go wrong when it comes to assessing a specific OT infrastructure that way?
I think the if you enter a fray where you have very specific scopes allocated to you,
Mhm.
or there is a very high level definition of a scope, which you immediately know from your experience is not going to be representative of where the majority of their risk is going to lie. Um, that either indicates an organization that knows that it has weaknesses, that it doesn't want to be exposed, or secondly, hopefully more favorably in this case, a scenario where the customer doesn't understand really what they have
Hmm.
and why they need to protect it or how they need to protect it. In most cases, I'm hoping in that scenario, the company would fall into the latter category, and in that case, the focus comes on helping them understand what the scope should be,
Hmm.
and that is the most important stage. The first stage of any reputable risk assessment process is all about asset identification and classification. Um, and before you risk assess anything, I think I've said this before in one of the videos we've done, you need to know what you have and what you don't. Um, and that's where your advisory process begins. You bring in the process, you bring in the metadata you need to capture, the classification scheme based on their understanding of business impacts and the technical capability and know how to get that data. And then you
Hmm.
can present back to them a potential revised scope that this OT environment in its whole is how you operate at this site or location, and therefore this should be the scope that we look at to make sure that we're not giving a false sense of security, excuse the pun, to senior management.
Got it. So that brings me to another interesting conversation that I was having with one of the OT cybersecurity stakeholders in a fairly large company. And what the discussion that we were having is they were a week into doing their assessment, and they had only 30% of the asset inventory with them, right? Like they knew for a fact that there were more assets connected on the network, and around 30% is what he was saying. So in such a scenario, right, like when they have 30% of the inventory and maybe a few architecture diagrams, what would be your recommendation? Do they proceed? Do they pause and look at completing the full asset inventory and then the assessment? What would be your advice to anybody who's in that situation?
It's a really good question. I think my answer would be a purist's answer, and my purist, mind would say you need to get to a point where you have a reliable view of what you have before you start down the formal risk assessment process. But in sites or distributed sites where the amount of I would say kit that you're looking at is huge, that process is in itself difficult, and very time consuming to build out that accurate inventory. So it depends what that 30% covers. If it's a 30%, if they feel that they've covered 30% of their sites that they have an accurate inventory of, then you start with that portion and you build from
Hmm.
there, and you can run the asset identification process for the other locations in parallel. But if it's only 30% accuracy that they think they have of all of the assets for one site, then you either focus on accelerating the asset identification and classification phase so that you build that up as much as possible. Um, or if there are obvious gaps that you can address, which are known and are so obvious and critical, such as insecure remote access, insecure use of maintenance laptops, removable media, lack of switch port security, what we call the fundamentals, you can start addressing those fundamental gaps
Hmm.
um, on the ground, as long as you've got the right stakeholder coordination and expertise available. And then you can just reflect that whilst you run the OT asset management or identification process in parallel. So long story short, you can't skip that process. You either make sure you get to as close to 100% visibility and accuracy as you can before you press play on the formal risk assessment, or you start it and you focus on securing fundamentals in line with it, but you don't not do it, because if you don't do it, then you're wasting your time.
Got it. So if we consider, like you said, if we start it and then improve as we go along, uh, would the analysis of that risk for that specific segment may say this 30% of the asset is um, focusing on one part of the distributed sites setup that you mentioned. Uh, would the analysis be accurate to begin with? Will it improve as we get more information?
It would improve as we get more info. So I think the when we we're quite adept at understanding what's on a site quite quickly, because we're lucky to have the platform that we do and the approach that we do.
Hmm.
So and for our own assessment process, we would want to make sure that we understand what the existing and what a target zone, conduit, trust boundary model looks like for a given site very quickly. And it's
Hmm.
if an organization just turns around off the bat and say we think we understand 30% on site, they're not going to know with any degree of certainty, nor should they be able to define what zones are within their current environment with any deal of accuracy. So
Hmm.
the only time in which I would suggest that you start mitigation or remediation efforts focusing on fundamental controls such as hardening is when you're dealing with a site which is so obviously fundamentally at risk that we need to cut off obvious threat vectors such as external or remote access, um, as well as any other points which present an immediate significant risk of the system, which we cannot wait to stop until the end of the process, if you get what I mean.
Got it.
So
Okay.
it is the most important thing, because without it, you can't address any of the top 5 critical controls that SANS puts out, such as vulnerability management, which is pragmatic and understanding what to patch. You just can't do it.
Got it. Okay. And do you think that, like, while doing assessments in your experience, because I've always seen that it's very difficult when somebody defines an impact, it's difficult to put a dollar value to an impact in OT.
Yeah,
So, do you think impact based risk assessments will change or have already changed? And like, is impact important, or do you think the consequence of something happening is important?
I think what a consequence triggers an impact. So
Mm.
if so, they're both important. But I agree with you. Traditional, IT or information security centric impact matrices and definitions are difficult to use in anger and in OT environment. Consequence is a really key word, because a consequence in an OT scenario, as we talked about, can be safety related, and
Mhm.
will be related to loss of availability. So impact, financial impact, compliance impact really is going to result in financial loss, financial impact. So the financial impact of a consequence, which itself could lead to a safety impact, is what we're focusing on. And the key ingredient there is how much money am I going to not make or lose, if that loss of availability of the process which that system supports is failing. So we need to be better to think quantitatively about OT cyber risk, by understanding the loss of availability criteria in financial terms better, and link that back to our assessments. And that's what I mean about the so what factor. Um, these companies are going to be very well run financially, so they are going to know how much money
Mhm.
they would lose should a site not operate for a day, a week, a month, etc. So you can give ranges or quantitative ranges based on the likely I would say, scale of a loss of availability, which is based on the lack of a maturity a client has, and also the I guess exploitability of one of the most plausible attack pathways that have been identified for that system or that site.
Got
Does
it.
that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So we've spoken about how you've done assessments in the past. What's your experience been? Now, I think let's look at the future, right? How is the future of assessments going to change? Do you have some thoughts around that? Will there be more use of AI, or with AI coming in, would the way that we do assessments change? Any thoughts on that?
I think yeah, I mean most consultants should be wary, of but also wary, but also empowered, by the rise of AI, and when it comes to helping us do our jobs better and faster, um,
Mhm.
and that enables us to deliver more value. But I think for the foreseeable, there's always going to need to be a human layer when it comes to articulating again that so what factor, to an end user, using the experience and the know-how or those battle scars that have been won through years of being at the coalface. So I think the role of the consultant will change in terms of more value being realized like further down the delivery time frame of a typical assessment. I think the understanding maturity and gaps and presenting that in a way which is digestible technically is and will continue to become easier and more effective with the use of AI. But that makes the output at the end of it in terms of how that's communicated more important. So you'll see the best consultants rising to the top, where they can take the output of an assessment, which may be leveraged much quicker and look nicer with AI, and make that more translatable and actionable. So our input will be more squashed towards the end, and we will be judged not just what the gaps are that we identify, but how we actually make that actionable for the for the actual end use that we're looking at, and that will include involving AI as part of what we develop for a client, and AI based detection that we have, for example, or assessment processes or GRC. So it will come at
Mhm.
the end of the process, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you for that. And you've I think, touched upon a lot of topics here. So if you wanted to leave the audience with one golden rule when it comes to avoiding pitfalls or mistakes when doing an IC 62443 or NIST-based assessments, what would that be?
Good question. I think, maybe a couple of principles rather than a golden rule. I think the first one is really clearly understand your scope, and based on that scope, understand what you have in terms of your
Mhm.
assets. It's the most important thing, and it's hard in OT, especially when you're dealing with old environments, but it's worth the pain at the end of it. The second point I would make is make sure you're using the right risk language that incorporates what the business that you're working with is familiar with, but also what you
Mhm.
need to consider from a compliance perspective if you are delivering a compliance assessment. Um, and the third thing I would say is, put yourself in the shoes of the risk owner or the business owner that is going to receive your report at the end of it, um, and ask yourself, by putting yourself in their shoes, are you able to understand what decisions that you need to make, or what the key
Mhm.
priorities are, which will reduce and demonstrate return on investment very easily? Because if you aren't able to answer those questions, then um, you need to be able to look at your process and ultimately how you are presenting your findings. So scope and asset management, Risk language and business, I would say, lens are the three things I would say need to be incorporated more into the assessments that I've seen done.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you so much. There are a few questions that were posted online, and it would be great if we can get some answers to them as well. So there's a question which says, are risk acceptance criteria formally defined and aligned with regulator expectations when you're usually doing uh, risk assessment?
No, is the answer to that question. I think depends how progressive the regulator is in the jurisdiction we're working in. But even then, an organization might have multiple regulators where the risk acceptance terminology do not add up. In that case, where you're in a jurisdiction where you might have a health and safety regulator and a cybersecurity technical authority, as well as maybe a third one, making sure that you are upfront and are incorporating risk acceptance criteria, which is common sense, but maybe is accumulates all of their, I would say, regulatory standards or agendas that they have published into one is wise. So getting ahead of the curve and being proactive and communicating your understanding of what a solid risk acceptance criteria is to them proactively is advised. But I've not seen like universal alignment on risk acceptance criteria between regulators and regulated entities done very well, personally. It's a gap.
Okay. Okay. There's another question. Are the assumptions, data sources, and results of a risk assessment validated and tested? For example, through workshops or scenario-based exercise, do we have to do that? Is the question.
Absolutely. You need to ground any gap in evidence and validation. When it comes to a technical gap, let's focus on something very specific. Should you identify that there is a gap in compliance to a security baseline for a PLC, you need to be able not only to demonstrate the compliance rating and what those key gaps are to the relevant standard, but validate that in the field by referencing and demonstrating some of the gaps that exist in the configuration for that particular asset, for example. But I wouldn't necessarily preempt that and bombard an end user with 15 sessions where you're going through every single finding in detail. You make sure you've got your evidence catalog ready as part of your report submission.
Mhm.
But in order to be proactive, I would maybe have one or two workshops where you're briefing key findings, where you have the evidence ready to demonstrate the veracity of your finding up front. So a key finding session or one or two workshops, I would expect that to be there as standard. And briefing the evidence as part of the messaging, particularly when there's a technical stakeholder group involved, is good practice. I would then let the customer or the end user come back to you based on the key findings of your report with questions where they may want to be walked through your validation of that particular finding. So be upfront with critical findings and evidence, and then be prepared to be questioned where they feel they need to understand more detail.
Thank you. Let's take one last question. Is the risk assessment process in a large organization like ours, how do we make it repeatable, cost effective, and integrated into our improvement cycles?
Good question. So to do that, there's two things. So let's look at the people, the process, and the technology aspects of that question. First of all, people, you need to make sure that you've got a cadre of personnel, be that
Mhm.
internal or consultants, who understand your operation and your sites so that their experience is transferable. because if you keep using a dozen different people or dozen different companies, you're going to lose knowledge with every exercise. So making sure you've got a core group of people focusing on one aspect of risk or the aspect of risk you're looking at is key. Secondly, the process itself needs to be designed to be repeatable. And that's all about making sure that they've got access to all of the right resources and frameworks that are relevant to your organization, and having the right procedure or process methodology documented for that. But thirdly, in this case, maybe the most powerful is how you manage the output of your assessment processes from a technology perspective. This is the only product plug I guess I'll make, but we have OT Hello, which is being designed to be a cloud-based and AI incorporating governance, risk and compliance capability, where you will be able to manage outputs and risk assessments, compliance to standards, all in one place, negating the need for laborious spreadsheets and PowerPoint or Word reports, and query that using AI. So making sure that you have the right technology available to support your people and process is important too, which is where we're going in terms of how we operate our assessments and how we deal with customers.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Josh. Those were the questions. As always, it's been an interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights. That's it. We'll be signing off now. Thank you.
Anytime. Thank you. Cheers.